Week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, and we are headed straight into week 14 of the season. We have 6 teams on bye week in what is the most crucial week of fantasy football yet, as we are 1 week away from the fantasy playoffs. So you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting moving into week 14. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 14 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 14's action. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 14's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, so let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. This week we'll have the Packers traveling to face the Lions in a good divisional matchup. This should be a good game, even on a short week. So let's start with the Packers side of things. Jayden Reed, your wide receiver 5 on the season in fantasy football. Doesn't exactly feel that way, but even with the inconsistency over the past couple weeks, Jayden Reed is coming in as your wide receiver 5 in fantasy football. A big week in week 13 in a tough matchup in a cold game at home against the Miami Dolphins. 19.7 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 24 receiving yards. Didn't do a lot of craziness there, but he did turn that into 2 touchdowns as well, which netted him those 19.7 fantasy points. So you look back since week 7, he's only hit double digits twice. Every other matchup, 9.8 or less fantasy points. It's been very tough to trust Jayden Reed, and I, for weeks and weeks, was encouraging you guys to keep trusting Jayden Reed. And admittedly, this past week, I was like, you know what, I think he's no more than a flex, right? Especially in a tough matchup against the Dolphins, but he came through for you guys. And I think we just got to continue to roll with Jayden Reed if you own him, especially in a week like this with 6 teams on bye week. This is a good matchup. This Lions secondary has been really weak overall, and they're banged up right now. They just gave up some really big fantasy performances to Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. Jayden Reed, I think, a very strong start this week. And you guys know I don't like short week games. I don't like Thursday matchups, but this is a player that I'm looking to start with confidence here in week 14. Romeo Doubs did suffer that concussion in week 12. He has begun to practice, so there's a good chance he plays this week, but he might be out this week. Then you got Christian Watson, 8.7 points this past week. Like, come on, I don't need to break it down. You guys know what Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson are when they're healthy. Complete boomer bust plays that you can throw into the flex out of desperation and cross your fingers. That's it. That's all I got on those two guys. Start them if you're desperate and hope for the best. This is a good matchup for what it's worth. And he got Tavion Wicks. I mean, also just completely boomer bust, but his ceiling has been incredibly low. Super difficult to trust him. Ever since that week 4 matchup against the Vikings, we just have not seen the same thing for the most part. So I'm avoiding Wicks going into the week. Now, we look at the Lions side of things. It's not as strong of a matchup for them, right? And let's start with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Has been playing at a little bit of a lower ceiling over the past 2 weeks, but he still has 7 targets in 2 straight games, 12.2 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. Just kind of missing that touchdown upside, so to speak, right? He had a touchdown in every game between weeks 3 and week 11. I think that there's definitely a chance at any point in time that touchdown upside can come back. So, I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown's your wide receiver 3 in fantasy. He's a start for me every week. We don't need to go any further. Yeah, it's a bit of a tough matchup. It's kind of a tough stretch to wrap up the season for the Lions wide receivers. They get Green Bay this week, Buffalo, Chicago, and San Francisco. It's not a fantastic stretch overall, but it's just going to be very difficult to bench Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, he can come through in any matchup. We know that. So even if the ceiling's a little bit lower, he's still a must-start player. Jameson Williams, just a good flex option, boomer bust guy. We look over the past 3 weeks, 22.6, 11.8, 9.6. You're going to get those ceilings. You're going to get those floors. He's the definition of a boomer bust option, but he's a top 25 wide receiver in fantasy. He can give you that ceiling. Just better cross your fingers and hope that you get the ceiling on any weekly period, right? Outside of anybody else here, Cleve Raymond, Tim Patrick, whoever else is on this roster, Allen Robinson, we're not starting them in fantasy. They're just not relevant enough. So you got strong starts in this matchup, some stud players, and this should be a good divisional matchup with a good game script. starting off the week, Thursday Night Football. Moving along to Sunday's action, let's start with the Browns, who are traveling to face the Steelers. Now, as most of you guys know, I have to record these before Monday Night Football, so don't exactly know how the Browns receivers look tonight in a tough matchup against the Broncos. And outside of that, if there's any major injuries, anything that changes my mind here, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. But I just kind of have all these guys as potential flex options on any given week. We know Cedric Tillman still dealing with that concussion, not playing in week 13. He could be back in week 14. And then you got Elijah Moore, Jerry Jeudy. Jeudy should give you a better floor. Elijah Moore, a little bit more boomer bust. See what happens on Monday Night Football. If my confidence level changes, I'll let you guys know. But I think the most startable player here is going to be Jerry Jeudy. The safest potential floor is going to come from Jerry Jeudy. Not a great matchup on paper, but in Week 13, Pittsburgh's secondary was essentially non-existent against Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and the Bengals wide receivers. Different receiver room than the Browns, but you could come through with a potential decent floor out of Jeudy or more. We got 6 teams on bye week. They are flex options. And I'll just leave it at that. Cedric Tillman is the one who actually concerns me the most due to the kind of inconsistency and the issues with the concussion over the past couple of weeks. But it would be really nice to see him kind of bounce back and come back in strong fashion for fantasy. Now, when it comes to the Steelers wide receivers, the Browns on the season have been very poor against opposing wide receivers for the most part. This is a great matchup for George Pickens. He has been playing fantastic since Russell Wilson took over at the quarterback position. You've got 16.4 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, double digits in every game since week 7, except for the snow game against Cleveland in week 12, which, by the way, completely erased any kind of view you have on this matchup due to their last matchup because it was a snow game, right? This is not going to be a snow game. Home game for the Steelers here. Might be cold or whatever, but we're not going to see that same type of weather that we saw in Cleveland in week 12. So don't look at Pickens' stat line of 8.8 points in week 12 and overthink it. He should be in line for a big game here in week 14. He's an absolute must-start wide receiver. Now, in terms of any other wide receiver on this team, there's just nobody. I know Calvin Austin has done some stuff in the past 2 weeks, and he could emerge as an interesting flex option this week, but unfortunately, got a little bit banged up in week 13 against the Cincinnati Bengals. He does have 2 touchdowns in his last 2 games, so he's interesting to keep an eye on as the week progresses, but there's also a chance he doesn't play this week. And in terms of Van Jefferson, Mike Williams, nothing here we can trust, so maybe keep an eye on Calvin Austin, but we're mainly just looking at George Pickens for the Steelers, and then you have some potential flex options for the Browns, with Jerry Jeudy being my favorite heading into week 14. Except we have the Saints traveling to face the Giants, and let's start with the Saints side of things with MVS. Told you guys, he's a good flex option last week. The ceiling wasn't as high, but he did have 11.6 fantasy points against the Rams. Just 3 targets, 2 catches, 36 receiving yards. But one of those was a touchdown, right? A touchdown or more in 3 straight games, with 2 touchdowns in week 10, 1 in week 11, 1 in week 13, the bye week in week 12 in between there. Double digits in 3 straight games. This is your most likely wide receiver on the Saints on any given week to give you points, especially with Taysom Hill out for what is likely going to be for the rest of the season. It's going to open up even more opportunities for MVS. Now, we did see a little bit of action to other wide receivers this past week, at least in comparison to the weeks before, but you're still not really looking at a ton of volume to anybody else here, anybody who's fantasy relevant. Still seeing healthy scratches, players on IR. It's been really confusing for these Saints wide receivers, but what we do know is that MVS is going to have some type of role. This is a good matchup for him. If you're desperate for a flex option, it really depends on what you got here, but MVS continues to be a flexible player going into week 14. That's really it for the Saints. We look at the Giants, okay? Malik Neighbors, I still think is very startable. There's still this collective panic around Malik Neighbors, and it's fair. Don't get me wrong, and the quarterback play is inconsistent. And I think at the time of recording this, the Giants don't even have an official starter quarterback this week, so I don't know what we're going to get. Drew Lock, Tim Boyle, Tommy DeVito, who knows? Maybe Phil Rivers will come out of retirement or something. Who knows here? But what I do know is that Malik Neighbors is probably going to get you double-digit fantasy points. Is the ceiling that high? No, but he's had 10 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, 10 or more fantasy points in every game on the season, except for week 7. So overall, Malik Neighbors still a good start here. 13 targets in week 13, 8 grabs, 69 receiving yards, 15.3 fantasy points. So this is a good matchup for Neighbors. I'm still rolling with him if I own him. And he still has one of the best overall strength of schedules for the wide receiver position to wrap up the season, with the Saints this week, the Ravens, the Falcons, and the Colts to wrap up the fantasy season. In terms of anybody else here, though, Rondell Robinson is just really fallen off in terms of fantasy production. He's not an option. Darius Slayton, no consistency there. 2.8 points this past week. Jalen Hyatt, anybody else here is just going to be a sit for me. At least we got Malik Neighbors to give you that floor, because the rest of these Giants wide receivers are just completely irrelevant from a fantasy perspective. Moving along, we have the Jets traveling to face the Dolphins. This is an interesting one, and let's start with Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams. Now, I had a little bit more confidence in Wilson last week than I did in Adams, but really on any given week right now, with the state of this Jets team and the state of this Jets offense, who really knows what's going to happen? I mean, we do know that Rodgers likes to target Adams, and it's felt like for quite a bit there he liked to target Wilson, but in the last couple of weeks, the production for Garrett Wilson has not been there. He has had 6 or more targets in 3 straight games, and even at 10 targets this past week, 10 targets, 5 catches, 41 receiving yards, just 9.1 fantasy points. But it seems like once they get close to the red zone, Rodgers prefers Devontae Adams. I took a little bit of heat last week because I had Wilson as a start. Adams is like, I'm just kind of done with this situation. I don't really want to risk him in a week with no bye weeks. And Adams, of course, had the better fantasy week with 17.6 fantasy points, 12 targets, 5 catches, 66 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He has double digits in 3 of his last 4 matchups. Wilson has double digits in 1 of the last 4 matchups. So, in conclusion, these guys are just flex options for me. It's not a great matchup against the Dolphins. If you have to start either guy here, I still think it's fine. I know we got 6 teams on bye week and all of that. Crucial week, but I really think it's kind of a coin flip situation here. I don't feel very confident in either guy this week. I don't think we're getting any change at quarterback. I know there's been rumors, but the Jets are sticking with Aaron Rodgers, and he's choosing to continue to play for the rest of the season. And all kinds of rumors around that. But listen, this is just one of those situations, like, it's kind of hit or miss. What's the upside? Tough to say. Tough matchup on the road here. They're just flex options for me, and I'm leaving it at that going into week 14. In terms of the Dolphins, the good news is that Tyreek Hill is back from a fantasy perspective. A little bit of inconsistency here, but he still has double digits in every game except for 2 since week 5, double digits in every game except for 1 since week 8. Double digits in 3 of his last 4 performances with 19 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. 20.3 fantasy points in week 13 in a tough weather game. Tough matchup on the road against Green Bay on Thanksgiving night. 9 targets, 6 grabs, 83 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now, the Jets secondary is allowing the bottom 5 amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They have been stout on the season. This is a team that's easy to run against, difficult to throw against, kind of a run funnel defense, right? But I still think Tyreek Hill, especially with 6 teams on bye, is in the start category for me this week. It's going to be tough to sit him if you own him. So I would just keep rolling with him. And he's got a pretty decent strength of schedule to finish the season. Outside of this week and week 6 against San Francisco, which San Francisco ranks high, but I think they're starting to kind of tear off, right? But he gets Houston in week 15, San Francisco in week 16, Cleveland in week 17. So I think Hill will be solid to wrap up the season. And the Dolphins getting a little bit hot right now. That offense does not look bad, and Tua has looked fantastic. But Jalen Waddle, for me, still remains in the flex category. He did come through in PPR formats with 11.3 points this past week, so still hit double digits, but a very low floor compared to that breakout, so to speak, game he had in week 12 with 28.4 fantasy points, given that he only had double digits in one other game on the season in week 1 against the worst defense in the NFL. So 4 targets, 4 grabs, 53 receiving yards this past week. You can start him in like a flex type situation if you got nothing better, but once again, Not a good matchup here, and I personally still don't have a ton of confidence in Jalen Waddle. I think this could come crashing back to earth at any time. But like I said, the offenses look better. The passing game looks good. Tua looks good. But the issue for Waddle is the pecking orders. Johnny Smith, Tyreek Hill, Devon Achane, and then Jalen Waddle, right? So startable, but I don't really see a high ceiling for Waddle in this matchup in Week 14. Next up, we have the Jaguars, who are going to travel to face the Titans. This is one of those games that you don't feel too excited about, but there could be some sneakiness in terms of fantasy in this one. Brian Thomas Jr., a start for me last week against a bad Houston Texans secondary. He came through for you, even if some of it was late in the game. 10 targets, 4 catches, 76 receiving yards, a touchdown, 18.7 fantasy points. Of course, if you were a B-Tom owner last week, you panicked a little bit because Trevor Lawrence had to exit the game early. And Mac Jones came in, but Mac Jones was not that bad last week. Hopefully that bleeds over into this week. I'm a little bit worried about it not going so well, but we shall see. Nonetheless, Brian Thomas Jr. is your wide receiver 6 on the season. He's given you double digits in every game except for 4. He's been great in his rookie season. It is a tough matchup on paper. The Titans have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, but I would say Brian Thomas Jr. with 6 teams on bye week is going to continue to be a start for me. Maybe he's in your flex spot. That's fine too, but he should be solid this week and come through with a good floor, right? Parker Washington had a big week in Week 13. He's a player to watch. He sits at 4% roster at the time I'm recording this, but until we see a consistent pattern here, which I know we only have a few weeks left on the season, but I'm just not comfortable starting him. I know there's a lot of teams on bye week this week. It might be worth picking up in a deeper format or a dynasty format, but I'm not going to overreact and try and chase those points. I've talked a lot about Houston's secondary throughout the season and starting wide receivers against them, so it doesn't surprise me that Washington had a good game. Once again, it's a tough stretch here for the Jags wide receivers to wrap up the year. Tennessee, the Jets, the Raiders, Tennessee again. So I'm probably staying away from Parker Washington unless I am truly desperate. Now we look at the Titans side of things. Calvin Ridley's been a little bit disappointing over the last 3 weeks. We only have one double-digit performance in Week 12 against Houston with 14.3 fantasy points. His other 2 games, 9.8 points, 6.5 points. Now he has had like a touchdown or 2 called back in that stretch and everything, but Ridley was on a really good pace there for a couple weeks between weeks 8 and week 10 with 12.3 or more points in 3 straight games and a ceiling of 25.4 fantasy points, but he has still been very good overall. And I still think in this matchup against the Jaguars, he's 100% in the start category. At home for the Titans, I'm expecting a good game out of Calvin Ridley this week. And then we got to mention my boy, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, who I have talked about this a lot lately. We have been talking about Nick Westbrook for weeks and weeks on the channel in our sneaky starts video and our last minute waiver videos, all of that stuff. And now it's like trendy and it's a big thing to talk about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine over the past 2 weeks or so. He has a touchdown in every game except for one since week 6. The volume is still super low, and I talked about that for the past couple of weeks as well. But we cannot take away the fact that he has a double-digit fantasy performance in every game since week 8, except for that week 10 matchup against the Chargers, right? He is producing. He is scoring touchdowns. He has the trust of both Will Levis and Mason Rudolph if for some reason he was going to come back onto the scene, right? And Will Levis has not been that bad the past couple of weeks by Will Levis standards. So it's a great matchup here. I've told some of you guys over the past couple of weeks, feel free to flex Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, and I'm still going to continue to say to flex him. He's a solid flex. At some point, he's going to have another bad game. He's going to come crashing back to earth, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be bad every single game for the rest of the season. And as a matter of fact, as I pointed out in recent videos, he has one of the best strength of schedules for the rest of the season. Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Jacksonville again. He could truly be a league winner and a solid flex option to wrap up the fantasy season. So he's a flex for me this week due to the matchup. Then we look at whoever's left here, and it's basically just Tyler Boyd. and he is just not relevant enough to start on a weekly basis. So got some flex options, got some solid starts in this matchup. We'll see what happens in week 14. Next up, we have the Falcons, who are going to travel to face the Vikings and maybe a little Kirk Cousins revenge game. But let's look at the wide receivers here. Draco London, your wide receiver 8 so far on the season. He's been fantastic. A couple bumps in the road here, single digits 3 times on the season, but every other game, double digits. Came through in week 13 with 16 targets, 9 receptions, 86 receiving yards, and 17.3 fantasy points. The Vikings have been very bad against opposing wide receivers so far on the entirety of the season. So Drake London, each and every week for me, is a must-start player. But here against the Vikings, he should be a absolute must-start player in the Kirk Cousins revenge game. I know Cousins has been struggling recently, but you got to like the narrative, right? Darnell Mooney is just a flex option every week. You never know what you're going to get. Are you going to get 5 points, 4.7 points, 14.6, 19.8? Those are his last 4 fantasy stat lines. So he's risky. It's a good matchup. Should be kind of a high-powered offensive matchup, you would hope and think. He's a potential start, top 20 fantasy wide receiver, but he's very risky. Ray McCloud does have double digits in 3 of his last 4 matchups and could be a play here, but he's just risky and riskier than Darnell Mooney. The last time he kind of saw a pattern emerging with double digits for Ray McCloud, he then had 5.6 or less points in 3 straight games. So he's risky, but maybe if you're desperate in a deeper league or a dynasty league, you could take a chance on Ray McCloud due to the matchup, but I would prefer not to, so I've got him as a sit. Justin Jefferson, each and every week is a start. Doesn't matter. I know the past couple weeks we've seen some inconsistency and all of that, but in week 13, 16.9 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 grabs, 99 receiving yards. You own JJ. There's nothing to break down here. You start Justin Jefferson in fantasy every single week. Jordan Addison, a bit tougher to call, but while the Vikings have been poor against opposing wide receivers, so have the Falcons. So I will continue to roll with Jordan Addison as a strong flex option this week. I actually probably like him more than Darnell Mooney. I think this could be a big Jordan Addison week, and he does have a touchdown in 3 of the last 5 matchups in double digits in each of those 3 games where he did score a touchdown. So he's risky, don't get me wrong, but I think this could be a good spot at home for Jordan Addison in a week where he could come through as a solid flex option. But as always, difficult to call when Jordan Addison is going to come through for you, but the matchup is there. Jalen Naylor, just no consistency whatsoever. We can't start him from a fantasy perspective. So this should be an interesting one. I do think we're going to have some wide receivers come through in this matchup in week 14. We'll see. And one line I currently love on Underdog is Drake London's total receiving yards, sitting at 66.5 receiving yards. He has hit that in 2 of his last 3 matchups, and the Vikings have been one of the worst secondaries in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers over the past couple weeks. So I think that London can absolutely come through and hit this stat line. Don't forget, guys, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting that free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 14. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on London's total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Next up, we have the Panthers, who are going to travel to face the Eagles. And this will be an interesting one, I think. And when we look over the past couple weeks, one thing I've been saying to you guys is the Panthers aren't this team that we're just sneezing at every week and just absolutely suck. They have shown some life really since Bryce Young came back from being benched, but specifically in the last 2 weeks in 2 tough matchups against the Chiefs and the Buccaneers, had a chance to win both of those games, and Bryce Young has thrown for over 260 passing yards, no interceptions, and at least 1 touchdown in each of those games, and actually in every game since week 10. So the passing game has been better. Actually, the defense has been better too. Maybe not against a run, but they've been better overall. Both sides of the ball have been better, and especially compared to the very beginning of the season. And with all that being said, the Eagles defense is just shutting down wide receivers left and right for the most part, and I don't really feel confident in starting any Panthers wide receiver this week. Adam Thielen, maybe if you're desperate and there's just nothing there in a deeper format, so he gets the asterisk. We talked about him in a great matchup going into week 13 as a flex option last week. 10 targets, 8 grabs, 99 receiving yards, a touchdown, and however you think or look at it, maybe 2 touchdowns. That 1 touchdown didn't count, but 23.9 fantasy points in a smash matchup. Don't forget he faces Tampa Bay again in week 17 in the fantasy championship. So Thielen, I think, is the most startable wide receiver here, but it is not a good matchup whatsoever. So I'm avoiding the Panthers wide receivers. I know some of you guys are going to get desperate this week. So if you do, you could try Adam Thielen. Leggett had 9.3 points. David Moore had 9 points this past week, and Jalen Coker has been dealing with that quad injury, and they're hopeful he returns this week. So I don't know exactly what the split's going to look like here at wide receiver, but to wrap it up, right? Adam Thielen, maybe startable if you're desperate. Outside of that, I'm just going to avoid this situation due to matchup. But the Panthers have been playing better offensive football for what it's worth as of late. We look at the Eagles. A.J. Brown, the ceiling's been a lot lower for the most part lately, but he's still the wide receiver 15 in fantasy and still a player that I'm starting every single week if I own him. 11.6 fantasy points in week 13 against Baltimore. 6 targets, 5 grabs, 66 receiving yards. I'm going to continue to start A.J. Brown left and right if I own him. There's really nothing to debate here. The Panthers, once again, have been better are defensively, but you're still starting A.J. Brown, no doubt about it. Now, we do have Dallas Goedert considered week to week with an injury. So although the absence of Devonta Smith last week didn't really benefit A.J. Brown, now we're getting the absence of Dallas Goedert at tight end, who is definitely the next most relevant pass catcher on this team. And we'll see if we get Devonta Smith back in week 14 or not. But you might see A.J. Brown as really the only true pass catcher outside of, I guess, Saquon Barkley on this team in week 14, or we could see Devonta Smith return and Dallas Goedert be out. So with all that being said, A.J. Brown stardom. Devonta Smith, I still think, is in the flex category if you own him and if he does play in week 14. I know there's been a lot of concern, a lot of panic around Devonta Smith, but I still truly believe if he was active and healthy in the last 2 matchups against the Rams and the Ravens, he would have had solid fantasy outings. This is actually a tougher matchup this week against the Panthers than it would have been against the Rams or the Ravens. But if you own him, especially with all these teams on bye week, I absolutely think Devonta Smith is flex worthy this week. And I'm not concerned in any way about Devonta Smith as a player or his potential production. The only thing that has worried me about Devonta Smith is that hamstring issue in any way lingering, like in weeks 10 and 11, how relevant was it there in those lower stat line games? And then we see him just not play over the past 2 weeks. So that concerns me more than anything. How healthy is Devonta Smith actually? But as long as the Eagles keep winning, I don't quite know that they're going to need him out there. So tough to say here with Devonta Smith, but with all these teams on bye week, he is still certainly a flex option going into week 14. Next up, we have the Raiders, who are traveling to face the Buccaneers, and this is going to be an interesting one. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. Jacoby Myers has been lighting it up, one of the most slept on wide receivers in fantasy on a yearly basis. He has been the wide receiver 30 or better in every season since 2021. We look over the past couple weeks. Since week 5, he's had double digits in every game except for 1. On the season, he's had double digits in every game he's played in except for 4. He's been fantastic. 15.7 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, except for week 11 against Miami. This past week, 15.7 fantasy points, 11 targets, 6 grabs, 97 receiving yards. And this is a smash matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of the worst units in the league against opposing wide receivers in fantasy. He's an absolute must-start player this week, and he's got a great strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Tampa Bay, Atlanta, Jacksonville, New Orleans. Start Jacoby Myers every single week, and it hasn't mattered if Aiden O'Connell was throwing the football or Gardner Minshew was throwing the football. He has come through and produced, and he's also produced in a lot of tough matchups, like against Denver and Kansas City and all that. So feel very confident if you own Myers this week. In terms of anybody else, Trey Tucker, DJ Turner, just not happening for me. Not enough consistency there whatsoever to start either of these guys. Every now and then, one of those two guys will pop up, and Tucker's been okay the past 2 weeks. Don't get me wrong, but he only had one catch this past week, which was a 58-yard touchdown, so I'm not going to read too much into it, but Myers is an absolute start this week. Mike Evans is a must-start every single week. Came through against the Panthers for you with 25.8 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 grabs, 118 receiving yards, and a touchdown. That was his first 100-yard game on the season. So a little bit surprising there, but you got to keep rolling with Evans if you own him. Plus the Bucs starting to get in one of these positions, even with 2 losses to the Falcons, where they can take that division. They're going to be playing their absolute hearts out the next couple of weeks. If you own Mike Evans, I don't need to break it down any further. It doesn't matter what the matchup is unless he's playing Marshawn Lattimore and the Saints. You are starting Mike Evans every single week. In terms of anybody else here, it would be nice to see Sterling Shepard or Jalen McMillan kind of step up here, but they have just not produced from a fantasy standpoint. So we're going to have to avoid both of those wide receivers going into week 14. Except we have the Seattle Seahawks who are going to travel to face the Arizona Cardinals. And this is a little bit of a tricky one. Let's start with the Seattle Seahawks side of things. DK Metcalf has been really disappointing as of late, and he should have an asterisk because he is technically dealing with a knee injury, but he's expected to play this week and be okay. But I mean, the beginning of the season, Metcalf was looking very solid for the most part. Had double digits in 4 of the first 7 weeks of the season, and then got hurt, missed 2 weeks, had the bye week, was okay in his first game back. Then in the last 2 weeks has been playing at a low ceiling, and it's been really kind of difficult to trust Metcalf on a weekly basis. Now we got this new knee injury popping up. JSN has been the most productive wide receiver here. Really tough to kind of track what to do with DK Metcalf. I was going to move him down to the flex category, and as most of you guys know, I was a little bit lower on Metcalf last week as well. But I think he's still startable. We got a lot of teams on bye week. This is an important divisional matchup here for both Seattle and Arizona, so I could see this being kind of a higher offensive day for both teams. So I'll still roll with Metcalf, but maybe it depends on what other options you have. Jackson Smith and Jigba, on the other hand, has double digits in every game this season except for 3. 11.9 fantasy points in Week 13, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 74 receiving yards. Keep rolling with JSN. He's a strong start. Even if he's in your flex, whatever it is, I would keep JSN in your starting lineups. He's a wide receiver 10 on the season. He's a strong start once again in Week 14. I will continue to roll with him essentially no matter what. Tyler Lockett, on the other hand, 4.6 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. I'm just not starting Tyler Lockett. He's really seen his production go down since the emergence of JSN here kind of mid-season. So Lockett, unfortunately, is going to be a sit unless maybe Metcalf doesn't end up playing this week. Then he could take a chance on Tyler Lockett. But outside of that, I'm basically done with Tyler Lockett for the remainder of the fantasy season. Just way too risky. Moving along to the Cardinals. Marvin Harrison Jr. was a must-start player for me last week in the must-start video, and encourage you guys across the board to start him last week. He came through 17 fantasy points in a good matchup, 12 targets, 5 catches, 60 receiving yards, and a touchdown. It's been super inconsistent the past couple of weeks. We look since, let's see here, week 8 of the season, 23.1, 3.4, 16.4. 7.7, 17. You're getting a double-digit performance every other week and a single digit in between those double-digit performances. But the Cardinals have had one of the most difficult strengths of schedule on the season, and it really starts to lighten up here. Seattle, New England, Carolina, the LA Rams. It'll get better here as the season wraps up, I think, for both Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. So if you own Marvin Harrison Jr., start him with confidence this week. I think he's going to be a solid start once again. It's not as good of a matchup as this past week, and I will note that Seattle's defense has looked good as of late. Arizona's defense has not looked that bad. But I still think both of these offenses will give us good stat lines for these wide receivers in Week 14. In terms of any other Cardinals wide receiver, you just can't trust these guys. Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, there's just not enough there. Michael Wilson comes through with a decent game here and there, but it's just not enough at this point in the fantasy season to risk, even with a ton of teams on bye week. He's always a player that you can pick up, plug in, and cross your fingers, but even then, the ceiling's not very high, so he's going to be a sit for me going into week 14. Next up, we got the Bears, who are traveling to face the Niners. And let's just start with the Bears side of things. Since Shane Waldron has been fired, this passing attack for the Bears has been absolutely heating up, and we have talked about that over the past couple of weeks. DJ Moore is just a start every week. I really think he's going to be a start for the remainder of the season. A pretty good strength of schedule. San Francisco, tougher on paper, but I don't know if I really trust that at this point in the season. Minnesota, Detroit, Seattle, pretty good overall strength of schedule. I think DJ Moore, who has 13.7 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, has moved up to the wide receiver 17 on the season. Strong start this week. Feel very good about him going into the week. Keenan Allen has really moved up to a strong flex on a weekly basis. Wasn't that great in week 11, but in the past 2 weeks, 23.6 fantasy points, 24.3 fantasy points, and 3 touchdowns, 73 or more receiving yards in each game, 5 or more receptions in each of the last 2 games as well. So he's going to stay in that flex category until we see that change. And I don't quite know that we're going to see that change as the season wraps up. Rome Odunze is the only wide receiver I have as a sit. Sure, he can pop up every now and then, but we look since week 4 of the season, he has 2 double-digit performances, 15.4 in week 9, 12.5 in week 11. And that's it. And the ceiling isn't even very high there. Every other game has been single digits with 9 or less fantasy points. He's going to have some involvement. He's going to pop up here and there, but it's just way too inconsistent for me when it comes to fantasy football. So I'm avoiding Rome Odunze. But I do think that Keenan Allen, good flex. DJ Moore, strong start. And like I said, maybe we'll see a Odunze pop up here and there, but I'm just staying away from it for now. When it comes to the Niners, I feel like I'm staying away from things here as well. I was really concerned about Jennings and Debo last week. Didn't really encourage you guys to start either player, although it was a tougher matchup. Not that it's a good matchup this week. Actually, the Bears might be tougher than the Bills, but it was a tough matchup last week, and then we were expecting the weather, which just made it feel even tougher, right? And Debo had 4 fantasy points, okay? Jennings had 8.6. It's just tough here. And, Jalen Johnson, a great corner. The Bears have been really good against opposing wide receivers on the season. They're flexible, and we're not getting snow in this game, at least. So, they're flexible here, but that is it. And you're crossing your fingers with both guys. I was tempted to put both Jennings and Debo as a sit, but I do think it will be better this week with Brock Purdy having a little bit more time to rest that shoulder injury. Then we're not playing in the snow. We're not just going to get dominated by the Bills all night. This could still be a tough matchup for these wide receivers, but I do think it'll be better overall for the Niners passing game this week. And of course, the Niners just continue to take hits, right? We got Trent Williams banged up. We got CMC out for the season. We got Jordan Mason heading to IR. They are just banged up on the defense, on the offense. It's just not their season this year. And that could start to affect everybody here if it isn't already. So be very cautious with Jennings and Debo. But of course, these guys can produce, right? Ricky Pearsall is just a sit. He has 0 receptions in 3 straight games. So staying away from Ricky Pearsall. It was nice to see a little splash out of him on the season, but staying away there. Now, there are some bad matchups here. Chicago this week, Miami in week 16, but some good matchups. The Rams in week 15, the Lions in week 17. So we can still see something out of the Niners receivers this year, but for the most part, they're looking like strong avoids and desperation starts only. Another line I love on Underdog going into week 14 is DJ Moore's total receiving yards, currently sitting at 59.5 receiving yards. He has hit that in each of the games with a change at offensive coordinator in each of the last 3 games. And in 2 of those, he absolutely smashed that with 97 and 106 receiving yards. So I am hitting straight to Underdog to take the over on DJ Moore's total receiving yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are getting that free NFL Pick'em for week 14. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on DJ Moore's total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash injury. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Next up, we have the Bills, who are traveling to face the Rams. And let's start with the Bills side of things. A little difficult to evaluate these guys because they played in the snow this past week, and it was Ray Davis and James Cook and Josh Allen celebrating getting engaged, and just a really fun game for the ground game there, but not so great in terms of fantasy production for the wide receiver position. And on top of that, like, we got Keon Coleman inactive this past week. Really difficult to call who's going to be the guy here. For me, for weeks and weeks, Khalil Shakir has been the guy and the most startable wide receiver when it comes to a fantasy perspective for the Bills. So I would continue to start him. It's a good matchup. He should come through with 10 plus fantasy points. That's what he does. He's done it every week of the season he's played, except in week 6 against the Jets and this past week in the snow against the Niners. And he was still the most targeted wide receiver and had the most receptions of any wide receiver this past week. It was just snowing like crazy, right? So I do like Shakir a lot this week. Safe flex, strong start. Upside's not crazy, but the floor is definitely there. Turns out anybody else, I'm not trusting Amari Cooper. If Keon Coleman plays, I'm probably not trusting him. Not touching Curtis Samuel whatsoever. And Mac Hollins does have some trust from Josh Allen and pops up. He obviously caught the touchdown in the snow in week 13, but that was his only target and catch. And, he does some stuff here and there, but it's just really tough to call this pecking order. And the way this offense rolls, right, is Josh Allen doing Josh Allen things, James Cook, Ray Davis on the ground, and then the wide receivers, and I guess Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid, when he is playing, are somewhere in there too. But ultimately, Khalil Shakir is the only wide receiver for the Bills, even though they're a great offense, that I trust. Moving along to the Rams, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. I mean, I start them every single week, regardless of the outcome. And I know Cooper Kupp had a really down game in week 13 with 4.7 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 17 receiving yards. I'm sorry. And like I said, just 4.7 fantasy points. And it's a tough matchup this week. And the Rams wide receivers have a really tough strength of schedule to wrap up here. Buffalo, San Fran, the Jets, and the Cardinals. So we'll see what happens here, but it's just really tough to bench these guys. People were worried about starting them in week 12 against Philly. I still encourage you guys to start them there, and they came through. So especially with kind of the position the Rams are in and kind of being on the outside looking in for a playoff spot here and trying to do whatever they can to get into the playoffs, and they do have a chance here. I still think we're going to see enough offensive output from Kupp and Puka to not get worried. And Puka was great in week 13 for what it's worth. 8 targets, 5 grabs, 56 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, and 17.3 fantasy points. So we look since week 8, since both of these wide receivers, Kupp and Nacua, came back, they have combined for 2 single-digit games. Every other game has been a double-digit fantasy performance. So I'm rolling with both of them, and I'm not overthinking it. Now, I've got Demarcus Robinson as a sit. He is going into the week a little bit banged up, but he's always a flexible option that can score, bring some upside, low volume guy, but he does get some looks in the red zone, can make some big plays here and there. We talked about him a lot throughout the season, but I just don't want to trust it. He does come up as a desperation start if you're in that position here with 6 teams on bye week, and you got nothing else, right? But ultimately, you're kind of crossing your fingers there. In terms of anybody else, Jordan Whittington hasn't had a target in weeks. I don't know if he shouldn't really be on the screen. Tutu Atwell, just 5.9 points this past week. There's just nobody else here since Kupp and Puka have come back outside of some splashes from Demarcus Robinson. So those are the only 2 Rams wide receivers I would start, and the only Bills wide receiver I would start is Khalil Shakir. Moving along to Sunday Night Football, we got a big divisional matchup when the Chargers and the Chiefs square off here for the second time on the season, and Ladd McConkey is your most productive rookie wide receiver this season in week 13 against Atlanta in a great matchup. 12 targets, 9 catches, 117 receiving yards, and 20.7 fantasy points. He now has double digits in every game since week 8, except for week 10 against Tennessee. He's been absolutely balling out, but he is going into the week with a knee injury, and there's a lot of uncertainty around this knee injury. So bear that in mind, because it's going to definitely be a potential factor this week. The last time he played the Chiefs, he had 17.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 67 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So if he plays, I'm confident in Ladd McConkey, who's moved up to the wide receiver 14 on the season. In terms of anybody else here, if Quentin Johnson was going to bounce back, It would have been last week against the Falcons, as they are an awful unit against opposing wide receivers. Maybe he comes back to life in like week 15 against Tampa Bay. But until we see it, he's going to be a sit for me in fantasy football. Josh Palmer didn't exactly come through either, as some people speculated, as he had 8 targets in week 12. And obviously Quinn Johnson was awful in week 12, but Josh Palmer had 4.1 fantasy points this past week. So is Lad McConkey or nothing right now? So let's cross our fingers that he is good to go in week 14. Moving along to the Chiefs, each and every week for the past couple weeks, D-Hop and Xavier Worthy have been flex options, and that's really it. It's not particularly a great matchup this week, but the Chargers defense has been bending a bit more as of late. Xavier Worthy had 10.4 points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 54 receiving yards in week 13. Hopkins had 9 targets, 4 catches, 90 receiving yards, and 13 fantasy points in week 13. So they're kind of missing that consistent touchdown upside. We have 3 touchdowns to Hopkins since he got signed by the Chiefs, traded to the Chiefs, and 2 of those came against Tampa Bay. We have 2 touchdowns since week 8 for Xavier Worthy. So the touchdown upside's not massive, and it's just kind of tough to call what you're going to get with these guys on a consistent basis. But at least over the last 2 or 3 weeks, for the most part, they've given you some flex appeal. It's just like, what kind of real ceiling is here? So they're definitely flexible, but they're not the top options that I want to rely on going into the week. But they do give you some potential, of course, going into the week. Juju Smith-Schuster, McCole Hardman, Justin Watson, anybody else here, they're not options from a fantasy perspective. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a big game and a good game on Sunday Night Football here in Week 14. And then to wrap up Week 14 on Monday Night Football, we got the Bengals traveling to face the Cowboys. And let's start with the Bengals side of things. One of the easiest wide receivers rooms to look at when it comes to fantasy football. You start Jamar Chase every week, and you start T. Higgins every week. Chase in week 13, 20.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 86 receiving yards. Higgins, 10 targets, 5 grabs, 69 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 17.9 fantasy points. Both have been fantastic on the season. Higgins has played far less, but if Higgins was fully healthy this season, I think he would be in the top 10 in terms of fantasy wide receivers. His production has been there. If you look at the stats, he hasn't been that much worse than Jamar Chase any worse than Jamar Chase, really, when you really break it down, although Chase has those massive upside games that Higgins probably wouldn't have, but I still think Higgins would be easily in the top 10 if he played in as many games as Chase has this season, but Chase is just killing it. Your wide receiver one. The Bengals, I mean, they're starting to get to the point where the season is probably over for them, but I think here in week 14 on the road against Dallas, they're going to keep putting out this offensive production, so I would keep rolling with Chase and Higgins. They are players that you absolutely cannot bench here in week 14. And I think you know that if you own either of them. In terms of Yoshi or anybody else here, I know he had a touchdown and 12.5 fantasy points in week 13, but that was one of 3 double-digit games that he's had on the season, and the other 2 came very early in the season, primarily when T. Higgins was still out or banged up. Anybody else here is not an option, so it's Chase, it's Higgins, that's it. Then we got CeeDee Lamb, who is dealing with a little bit of an injury, shoulder injury, going into week 14. He's had some other injuries pop up in the past couple weeks, but he is expected to be good to go and expected to play in week 14, and this is a great matchup. You got one of the worst defenses in the NFL in the Cincinnati Bengals. Great matchup for him. They've been awful against wide receivers from a fantasy perspective. You own CeeDee Lamb, just keep rolling with him as long as he's healthy. Keep rolling with CeeDee Lamb. I do have some fears that at any point, like, the Cowboys might not want to risk his long-term health. He might not want to risk his long-term health. He's had enough injuries pop up now over the past couple of weeks to where they could easily shut him down for the season, and they haven't. So if he plays, keep rolling with them, and he's got a really good strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Outside of week 17 against Philly, he's got the Bengals, the Panthers, and the Bucs. So he could literally be a league winner as long as he's healthy and keeps rolling. You continue to roll with CeeDee Lamb. In terms of anybody else here, I forgot to put Brandon Cooks' name on the screen. That is my bad, but I do think Brandon Cooks is interesting. He had 7 targets, 3 grabs, 16 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 10.6 points in week 13. It's a good matchup for him this week, and he did kind of slide into that wide receiver 2 area, but that was with Lamb a little bit banged up, so it's kind of tough to say. But he had more targets than Jalen Tolbert or Kevontae Turpin, so Side note, should be on the screen. I apologize, but Brandon Cooks could be a sneaky start, a sneaky streaming option against this Bengals defense at home this week. In terms of Tolbert or Turpin, I'm staying away from both those wide receivers going into the week. So a lot of studs in this matchup. Make sure you start them. But outside of that, we're primarily looking at a potential stream in Cooks and then all sits for any other wide receiver in this Monday night matchup. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single wide receiver, every single matchup for week 14 of the fantasy season and who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 14, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need on a weekly basis to help you guys dominate fantasy football. So make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.